All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at something absolutely fascinating today: how warfare's strangest ideas evolved from the eccentric concepts of unfunded inventors into these massive, wildly expensive government projects that ultimately culminated in the nuclear age. You see, for most of history, weird weapons were pretty much limited by the depth of a single inventor's pockets. But as warfare industrialized, so did the sheer scale of the absurdity. So, here's our roadmap. We're going to build this chronologically, starting with ancient and medieval ingenuity, moving into gunpowder and industrial age oddities, then exploring World War government funding, and finally finishing up with Cold War nuclear absurdities. We'll be spanning a massive timeline here, all the way from 213 BC right up to 1957. And the big takeaway I want you to keep in mind as we move through these eras is how unique constraints and funding models gave birth to entirely different, bizarre footnotes in military history. All right, part one: ancient and medieval ingenuity, where it was all about working within local constraints. Early strange weapons weren't exactly born from unlimited budgets. They came from hyper-specific local limitations. Take the ancient city of Syracuse in 213 BC. They had to defend themselves but had absolutely no fleet to speak of. So, a 70-year-old mathematician named Archimedes basically turned the city wall into a machine. He built this massive system of levers, counterweights, and hidden teams hauling ropes to power an iron claw on a crane arm. It reached right over the wall, literally lifted these heavy Roman warships, these giant quinqueremes, straight out of the water and dropped them onto the rocks. It was so terrifyingly effective that it turned a siege meant to last 2 weeks into a grinding 2-year standoff. Fast forward a bit to the 3rd century AD, and we see Chinese strategists making a really interesting trade-off. They swapped armor-piercing power for pure speed. They invented the repeating crossbow, which dropped fresh bolts into place with a single lever, letting you fire 10 shots in just about 15 seconds. Now, because the draw was weak, it often couldn't pierce armor, so what did they do? They adapted. They dipped the bolts in poison, letting a mere scratch do the killing. And instead of just being a weird historical footnote, this rapid-fire weapon stayed in service for 2 millennia. It was actually carried by Chinese troops going up against modern rifles as late as the War of 1894. Now, Korea, they took that ancient rapid-fire concept to the absolute extreme, mainly because they had a different local advantage. They had gunpowder to spare. Built in 1451 under King Munjung, the Hwacha was this wooden cart designed to fire 100 singing arrows strapped with gunpowder tubes in one single volley. And this wasn't just some crazy prototype. At the Battle of Hangju in 1593, a small Korean fortress force of under 3,000 men managed to hold off roughly 30,000 Japanese troops. They set up about 40 of these carts and just fired roaring sheets of flame down into the mass assault columns for a full day. A cart full of fireworks literally did the work of an entire army. But flip it around. What do you do when you have literally no metal at all? Well, you get what's probably the strangest weapon in the Americas, the Aztec macahuayatl. It was a flat, hardwood paddle edged with rows of obsidian blades. For context, that's volcanic glass that fractures to an edge sharper than modern surgical steel. Bernal Diaz, a soldier marching with Cortez in 1519, actually noted it was capable of taking a horse's head off with a single blow. Crazy, right? But because obsidian shatters against steel, the empire that carried it ultimately fell. And in a sad bit of irony, the last surviving original macahuayatl didn't fall in battle. It was completely destroyed in an 1884 storage room fire in Madrid. Moving on to part 2, gunpowder and industrial age oddities. This is where we hit the funding wall and early physics. In this era, you had these brilliant inventors with magnificent ideas, centuries ahead of their time. But they constantly hit this massive brick wall of royal funding, not to mention the rigid, unforgiving laws of physics. Just look at Leonardo da Vinci's 1481 job application to the ruler of Milan. He sketched out a gun with 33 barrels, arranged in 3 fan rows on a rotating frame. I mean, Da Vinci essentially designed the exact firing cycle of a modern machine gun 400 years early. But like most of his military ideas, it never left the page during his lifetime, simply because no ruler was willing to foot the bill to build it. And then there's James Puckle in 1718. This London lawyer patented a tripod machine gun capable of firing an unprecedented 63 shots in 7 minutes. But he failed to get any investors because he had this completely wild dual ammunition concept. Get this: round bullets for Christians and square bullets for Turks to deliberately cause crueler wounds. The military never ordered it. As one newspaper joked at the time, the only people ever actually wounded by the Puckle gun were its unfortunate shareholders.
By the time we hit the industrial age, the game changed. You didn't need a king's patent anymore. You just needed local funding. Like in 1862, when a Georgia dentist, yes, a dentist, raised money to build a cannon with 2 barrels. His big idea was to fire 2 cannonballs connected by an 8-foot chain to just mow down Union infantry. The reality, though? Total, absolute chaos. The barrels simply wouldn't fire at the exact same instant. During the test run, the chain snapped, the flying balls wrecked a chimney, and a cow standing well away from the target just dropped dead. The Confederate arsenal promptly and very wisely declined the invention. But hey, it wasn't all just crazy failures. The Colt torpedo was a terrifyingly rare success story in the weird weapons department. Designed in 1864 by the Confederate Secret Service, it was a hollow iron casting cleverly disguised as a lump of coal. When shoveled into a Union steamboat furnace, it would just detonate and burst the boiler. It actually destroyed the Union headquarters boat Greyhound, which forced Admiral David Porter to issue a standing order that anyone caught with one of these deadly lumps of coal was to be shot on sight. Which brings us to part 3, World War government funding, or as I like to call it, throwing millions at dangerous ideas. 9 meters. Just picture that for a second. That's the height of a 3-story building. And it was literally the height of the front wheels on Russia's 1915 Tsar Tank. This represents a massive turning point, where individual pockets and local dentists were replaced by entire national governments willing to fund spectacular, large-scale madness. Pitched by an engineer and enthusiastically funded by Tsar Nicholas II himself, the idea was that wheels this massive could just roll right over enemy trenches without even noticing them. However, physics intervened yet again. On its very first trial, the massive front wheels did fine, but the small rear roller instantly buried itself in soft ground. No engine in Russia could pull the thing free, so it just stood rusting in the forest until it was finally scrapped in 1923. So if World War I funded one madman's machine at a time, World War II funded entire departments of them. I mean, the U.S. military actually spent roughly $2 million on Project X-Ray, which was pitched by a Pennsylvania dentist. The actual, literal plan was to arm 1,000 bats with tiny, timed incendiaries, pack them into a bomb casing, and release them over Japanese cities. And the crazy thing is, it worked violently well. During a 1943 test in New Mexico, armed bats escaped, roosted under a fuel tank, and literally burned a section of an Army airfield to the ground. The project was only canceled because the atomic bomb was almost ready. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the British Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development was cooking up the Panjandrum in 1943. Picture this, a massive drum of explosives flanked by 2 10-foot wooden wheels, propelled by 70 rockets, designed to charge up a Normandy beach and blast a giant hole in the Atlantic wall. The reality of this terrifying concept, though, was absolute chaos. During its 1944 trial, the rockets tore loose, the giant explosive wheels swerved wildly off its line, scattered the assembled generals, and simply chased a spectator's dog down the beach before finally exploding. Unsurprisingly, the invasion of Normandy ultimately proceeded without it. And Germany's bizarre contribution? That would be the Krumloff in 1944. Designed for the brutal urban combat of Stalingrad, it was a curved barrel extension fitted with a periscope of mirrors that allowed soldiers to shoot around corners without exposing their bodies. It was an incredibly innovative concept, but once again, physics collected its fee. Bullets forced around that harsh bend often shattered inside the barrel, spraying unpredictable fragments everywhere instead of a clean shot. Plus, the immense friction meant the 30-degree barrels completely wore out after just 300 rounds. Finally, let's jump into part 4, Cold War nuclear absurdities, where the strangeness shifts entirely to nuclear yield. So after 1945, the weirdness stopped being about the physical shape of the weapon. No more giant wheels or bat bombs. Instead, the strangeness moved entirely into the devastating existential yield of the weapons themselves. In 1957, Britain designed the Blue Peacock. This was a 10-kiloton nuclear landmine intended to be buried in the North German plain to halt a Soviet advance. But here's the catch. Electronics freeze in a German winter. Incredibly, the official proposed solution was to seal live chickens inside the bomb casing with a week of feed, relying on their body heat to keep the electronics warm. 2 prototypes were actually built before the project was wisely canceled in 1958. Mostly because secretly bearing nukes under Allied territory was deemed a bit politically awkward. And get this, because the file was declassified on April 1, 2004, reporters genuinely thought it was a joke.
Officials from the National Archives literally had to go on record to confirm that the chicken-powered nuclear landmine was a historical fact and most certainly not an April Fool's prank. Over in America, though, the absurdity took a different path: miniaturization. They literally shrank the atomic bomb until just 2 men could carry it. Enter the Davy Crockett, deployed in 1961. It fired the W-54, which was the smallest nuclear warhead the United States ever fielded. Roughly 2,100 of these tiny weapons were built and handed right over to small military units in Germany, explicitly aimed at Soviet tank columns. Now, the math on the Davy Crockett's lethal zone, it was deeply uncomfortable. With a maximum range of about 4 kilometers, the warhead threw out a zone of lethal radiation hundreds of meters wide. The terrifying reality was that a short shot, bad ground, or even just a stiff gust of wind practically guaranteed the operators were standing directly inside the kill radius of their own weapon. A live Davy Crockett was fired for the last time in the atmosphere on July 17, 1962. After that, they just sat in bunkers, waiting for an order that thankfully never came. Which really brings us to this profound realization. Think about it. Every era before the Cold War built these weird weapons just to see what they did. They tested them on ships, in fortresses, or chasing dogs on beaches. But the nuclear age was the very first era that built a weird weapon and decided it could absolutely never afford to know what happened if it was actually used. Which leaves us asking, as we look at this wild evolution from Archimedes' crane all the way to a chicken-warmed nuclear landmine, what should we really take away from this? When our most bizarre inventions become too existential to ever deploy, what is the true cost of our relentless pursuit of destruction?